There we are. We're live.
Okay.
But I think that's the trailer.
We humans, like all other species, are naturally exploitive. Except that now we have the capabilities, the tools, the energy resources to dominate this planet. What is it about the way we have evolved to think and act that is shaping this world that we have so recently created? Mankind faces a challenge unlike any other in its history. And it's a problem that evolution did not equip us to solve. We are living in a momentous time, facing our most important test ever. Is it even reasonable to believe that we who created the problem in the first place might also be able to stop it? And if so, allow future generations to avoid a desperate and deadly world left to them by us?
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is John Zavalny. My students call me Mr. Z. I'll be your host today as we talk about an intriguing new climate change documentary produced by Jim Swift and directed by Susan Kucera titled 12th Hour. What I found so intriguing about this film was the idea that our human evolutionary history may play a major role in how we think and react to our warming planet. Before I introduce my guests and begin our conversation about the 12th hour, I'd like to share a little bit of my background. I retired after 30 years with the Los Angeles Unified School District. 20 of those years were at the Fauché Learning Center, a K-12 public school in South Los Angeles, where I taught middle school science, high school biology, and environmental studies at both levels. My other 10 years were with the LAUSD science branch, helping to support and train science teachers. I also helped to run a 3.5-acre urban farm field trip site, the San Pedro Science Center. My real passion is environmental education and getting inner city students to understand and to experience the natural world. I've been very fortunate to have received several educational awards, including Disney's American Teacher Award, the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science Education, and the Global Leadership Award in Education from the Jane Goodall Institute. My wife and I saw former Vice President Al Gore tape his speech show that later became The Inconvenient Truth. Once he announced he was going to train presenters, I applied and was accepted. I was in the third group ever trained, January 2007. While I was stationed at the San Pedro Science Center, I made it part of my job to provide climate education in as many classrooms as I could get into to as many students as possible, quickly becoming one of the top presenters in the organization. Which leads me to kind of why I'm here today. I work with Michael Cahert at the Video Project, helping to provide free environmental documentaries to schools. I provide the educational components for the films along with in-person classroom facilitation. I've already introduced to several classrooms the 12th hour. You know, I've never heard of the mismatch hypothesis theory before I watched the film. The idea that our society and the environment are both changing at such a rapid pace that our brains cannot evolve fast enough to deal with these new issues. This was something I had never considered before. My guest today is somebody who has much more expertise in these areas than I do. Dr. Joseph Tainter studied anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, and then Northwestern University, where he received his PhD. Dr. Tainter is a professor in the Department of the Environment and Society at Utah State University. His best-known book is Collapse of Complex Societies, which examines the collapse of Maya and Chacoan civilizations, as well as the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. He is also the author of Drilling Down, Off-Oil Debacle, and Our Energy Dilemma. His research has been used in over 40 countries, as well as the United Nations Environmental Program, UNESCO, and the World Bank, just to name a few. Welcome, Dr. Tainter. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. Now, the way I understand it, your expertise is studying past civilizations and trying to figure out why their societies collapsed.
Yeah, so this is a study I began actually in the 1980s. We know that after the development of agriculture, human societies just grew more and more complex as our populations increased. And then periodically there would be situations where fairly complex societies would collapse. They would rapidly simplify. Very often governing institutions would be lost. Sometimes literacy would be greatly reduced, nearly lost. Bureaucracies would go away. And people would have to live more simpler, more isolated, more localized lives. These are what are collapses. These are collapses. One of the famous examples, of course, is the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. Another famous one is the collapse of Maya civilization in the 9th century AD in Central America. And there have been several others. I total about 24 cases of collapse around the world. So a collapse is a rapid simplification. It's a rapid loss of the complexity of a society. And as I was doing this study, I realized that what I was learning was not just about ancient societies, but it had implications for us today and for our future. So increasingly, beginning about 30 years ago, I began orienting my own work, my research and my teaching towards sustainability issues and sustainability that face us today. Climate change, of course, being a major one.
Okay, so now I understand you've participated in 3 films with Susan Kucera, The 12th Hour being your third. So how does your expertise in past civilizations, and you just made a connection to our civilization now, connect to the 12th hour and to climate change?
Well, Susan came to Logan, Utah, where my university is located, to interview me a number of years ago. And we talked broadly about case studies, the historical case studies in collapse, but also more importantly about what it means for us today. We are the most complex societies that have ever existed on Earth. And the important factor to keep in mind is that that complexity always has an energy cost. So the way we live today is only possible because we have fossil fuels to keep us going. But fossil fuels, of course, as we know, are causing the problems with climate change. So in a way, we are using the substance that allows us to live the way we do, energy, ultimately to destroy the way we live.
Well, that's kind of scary to think about that, isn't it? That the way we live is actually damaging our planet, and it still seems like some people have a hard time understanding that.
Yes.
What do you think? How do we get people to understand that?
Well, increasing numbers of people do, but of course, most people live their lives locally and day to day. That's how the human species evolved to live locally among people we know and to live day to day. Humans did not evolve to be broad scale thinkers. What I mean by that is that humans did not evolve to think broadly in either time or space, because our long distant ancestors never faced evolutionary pressure to think that way. There was never natural selection for the ability to think broadly in time or broadly in space, because our ancestors never needed to. So we are simply a species that is not programmed to think broadly about the problems of climate change and other long-term global problems. And the film makes this point very well.
Okay. So what message do you think the audience will get from this film?
Oh, I think they will. It's an excellent film, and the photography is very beautiful. I think it will resonate with people who see it. The interviews are superb. The people who are talking in the film clearly make the points that I'm trying to make here with you, which is that we are not suited to deal with a problem such as climate change. It's something that we have to learn to deal with. And we have to teach our children to think in a different way to deal with these long-term, broad-scale problems.
Right. So do you see this film shifting perspectives and leaving an impact? Why, and if so, what way?
Well, it's one of many efforts that are underway to get people to become aware of the problems of climate change and of how we really have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels in order to become sustainable. I do see a shift beginning, particularly with the emphasis these days on electric automobiles and how the major auto manufacturers are recognizing that they need to reduce the output of fossil fuel driven vehicles. So they are doing so. We are seeing changes underway, but it's important to keep in mind that these changes won't be rapid, and that's a problem. In the past, changes in energy source have usually taken anywhere from 40 to 50 years to become ingrained and widespread in a way of life. And in a transition from fossil fuels to what we hope will be renewable sources with our lives powered by electricity, this is going to be the case. It will not come about quickly.
Yeah, well, we've actually been trying to do this for almost 40 or 50 years, it seems like, and haven't made much progress. Do you think if we had made progress 30, 40 years ago, we wouldn't be in shape today?
Well, yes, if we had made progress several decades ago, we would be well on our way to averting the major part of the problem. But of course, we didn't. And it's really only, I think, been in the last 10 to 20 years that more and more people have become aware of the problem and have become interested in primarily in forms of transportation that don't use fossil fuels or that don't directly use fossil fuels.
Right. Okay. So in an interview with Buzzsprout, you said that if you were younger, you'd like to spend more time talking to K-12 educators. You just mentioned earlier about how talking to young people, how to think a little differently to solve problems. Well, I'm a K-12 educator, and there are probably some out there listening right now. Or if they're not, they can probably watch the tapes later. So, you know, one reason I think I'm hosting this is because I'm a K-12 educator, and you know I kind of have to bring things down to the level where my students can understand it. And so, is there there are ways that you make it more accessible to K-12 students who will view the film? That's kind of what I think my role is in this.
Well, I'm not a K-12 educator. I don't know how to educate children in that age range. The reason why I say that goes back to the point I made that we did not evolve through natural selection to think broadly in time or space. So the question then becomes, can we be taught to think broadly in time and space? Can we develop an inclination to do so? And that's where I think we have to begin in the early years of grade school education. As I say, I'm not a K-12 educator. I'm not sure how to go about this myself, but yourself and other K-12 educators, I hope, would know how to do this. It's just a question of reaching them and getting them to impart this to their children.
Yep. Yeah. I've been trying to reach as many students as I can for the 15 years I've been doing this, and you hope you're making a difference, but you just don't know for sure.
Yes, true.
So in what ways do you think documentary filmmaking is a useful educational tool and impactful, especially for non-expert audiences?
Oh, well, we're not actually a literate species, although these days almost everyone can read and write. We are a visual and oral species. Oral meaning we learn by hearing and then we learn by seeing. That's why these films are so important. They grab people's attention in the way that a book or a magazine article will not grab most people's attention.
Right. Okay. So I was trained to learn to use explanatory metaphors to help explain some climate concepts in a less scientific way and make it more accessible and understandable. I say things like heat trapping gases instead of greenhouse gases because it kind of describes what they do, and also like a heat trapping blanket. I've heard other experts using these same phraseologies. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about the mismatch hypothesis theory, because I don't have your expertise. So if I mistake something or say something incorrectly, please correct me. But I've seen it called both a theory and a hypothesis. Which is it?
I don't think of it as either. To me, it's obvious.
Okay.
I mean, it's not something to question. We know from contemporary hunter-gatherers that our hunter-gatherer ancestors did not experience natural selection to think broadly in time or space. But that's exactly what is required to get us through our current problems.
Okay, makes sense. So yeah,
I don't worry whether it's a hypothesis or a theory or whatever. To me, it's simply obvious.
Yeah, to me, that's just a science teacher question. I've seen both, and I'd like to know, which one's the correct one to use. So in the beginning of the film, you talk about natural selection, and then talk about what was considered to be the normal human condition in the past, and then you talk about the new normal condition now. So could talk a little bit about how that fits into the mismatch theory, and how that then mismatch theory fits into climate change?
Well, as others have made clear, we are not naturally inclined to be afraid of things that are not immediately at hand, and not not going to affect us in the near future. We evolved to be afraid of things that might affect us in the short term, that we become aware of as threatening immediately. So I go back to our early history. We didn't evolve as a species to deal with long-term intangible problems like climate change or like other sustainability issues. And this is where the term mismatch, I think, comes in, that there is a mismatch between what we might call human nature, the way that we evolved to be as a species, and the challenges that we face.
So kind of when I talked to some students about this earlier, I kind of said it's like kind of trying to break a habit that you've had for 20,000 years. How do you do that?
Well, except the habit is in our genes, and you can't break it.
Can't break a habit. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even calling it a habit is
incorrect. Wrong. Thank you. That's why I need to hear that.
It's natural selection that made us the way we are.
Right.
So what can you do? Well, this is where I keep coming back to people like you, to K-12 educators, to get them to begin teaching students to think, just to be interested in problems around the world and how other people live and what affects them, and also problems that they can't see immediately, like climate change. To become curious about those, so that they, as they grow, as they mature, as they become adults, they keep track of what is happening in those areas.
So off script a little bit, but just thinking about what our kids today are born with. Like it seems like they're born with a phone in their hand. The technology is part of them, and it's made the world much smaller. But it also exposed them to so much data that's wrong or incorrect or misinformation. I mean, how do we help students get through that?
Well, the key is to make it interesting, to make it attractive, which this film does. It does a very good job of it.
Great.
Beyond that, I'm not an entertainer, but entertainment is the key.
Okay, yeah. I used to call what I did in my classroom edutainment, because especially with middle school, you have to keep them engaged and entertained and doing that kind of stuff. So you're a long-time professor of sustainability. You've been teaching that for a long time. And it seems that word now has been so overused and used incorrectly. Is there a way that you could use something like explanatory metaphor or some way to describe what sustainability is to somebody like who's not an expert in that?
Yeah, I go back to the root word sustain. To sustain something is to continue it, to support its continuation. And what we want to sustain is our way of life, which is rare and recent in human history. To sustain our way of life, the two critical factors that I see are energy and innovation. So those are primarily what I work on in the realm of sustainability, energy and innovation. Now, I begin my class in sustainability talking about what life would have been like, let's say somewhere in Western Europe, which I'm most familiar with, let's say 250 years ago. life expectancy would be about 40 years. A woman might expect to have 6 to 8 children, of which 2 would live to adulthood. There would be almost nothing of what we consider education, and those eligible for education would be either young people, primarily young boys, recruited into the clergy, or the offspring of the nobility. And those would be the only ones who received anything in the way of formal education. Most people would have no knowledge of the world beyond maybe some surrounding villages. 90% of us would be farmers, meaning 90% of us would be involved in producing energy. And things that we take for granted, in the medical realm, something like appendicitis would be a gruesome way to die. We just take for granted that we can solve it. If a person comes down with appendicitis, you take the appendix out. In the past, this option wasn't available. So what I tell students is that the difference between then and how we live now is what we want to sustain.
Good. That makes sense. I like that. Now, in another interview with Buzzsprout, you said that the human species is a species that always muddles through. And I take that to mean that, do you think the human species is going to get through this climate crisis one way or another? Could you expand a little bit on what muddling through might look like in the future?
Well, yes, I think we will get through the climate crisis, but it may not be with the way of life we have now. Muddling through means you proceed step by step without a definite plan. You take circumstances as they come and try to deal with them. That's muddling through.
Okay.
That's most of what humans have ever done. We've never lived according to long-term plans. Perhaps we could now, and perhaps muddling through wouldn't be necessary, but I doubt it. I think we're going to muddle through. Okay.
But it's not going to be pretty, is it?
It may not be pretty at all. That's correct.
Okay. So, I'd like to think of our time here together as more like a conversation than an interview. So is there, we've talked a little bit before. So is there anything you'd like to ask me about my K-12, education career? And I'm a real advocate for scientific, environmental, climate change literacy for all students and the general public. Is there anything that you want to ask a K-12 educator?
Well, among the students you've educated as they grow, if you've been able to keep in touch with any of them, what do you see?
The ones I do run into have changed their lifestyles some. We do projects in my classroom all the time about recycling and eating healthy food and eating less meat and all the things little things that we can do to make a difference. So a lot of them have adopted those lifestyles, which makes me feel really, really proud that I reached them. But it's always the individual changes that they're talking about, not the systemic changes that we really need to go after. But they do add up and make a difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've had success.
Yes, I have had success. Yes, I agree, and that's what we are as educators. That's the only success we get is when we talk to our students. That's our reward, isn't it?
That's indeed, yes.
Okay. So, do you have any new projects or initiatives you're working on that you'd like to spotlight today?
Well, in the area of sustainability, I work primarily on energy in society and innovation, and I consider the innovation study to be the most important thing I've done since I did the Collapse book back in the 1980s. People who are referred to as technological optimists argue that sustainability isn't an issue, that as long as we have market forces and the government doesn't screw things up, that there will always be incentives to innovate. So that resources are never scarce, they're just priced wrong. And what we need is price incentives, the marketplace, to encourage people to innovate and come up with new technologies and new ways of living that will solve problems like climate change. This belief is very, very widespread. It struck me that it depends on an assumption that the technological optimists are not aware that they're making. And the assumption is that the productivity of innovation continues at least a steady pace into the indefinite future. Now, since I study complexity and how complexity always has a cost and how complexity can constrain the way that we live, the way that we solve problems, although it can also help us solve problems, it seemed to me that this boils down to a question of do our investments in innovation actually yield a constant return into the foreseeable future? Well, for a long time, I didn't have an answer to that question. And then, I guess about 15 years ago, I ran into a couple of economists who had a database of patents from the U.S. Patent Office that I could use, that we could use together to solve that question, to address that question. So we put together a study of trends in U.S. patenting and how many scientists it takes to achieve innovation breakthroughs. And what we found is that the productivity of innovation, which we measure as inventions per scientist, have been declining. The converse of that is that it is taking more and more scientists working together to achieve breakthroughs. One of the classic examples, of course, is Moore's Law. When I give talks about this, someone always raises their hand and says, yes, but what about Moore's Law? Moore's Law is, well, it's not really a law, it's an observation. It's the observation beginning in the 1970s that the number of transistors on a chip will double in number and decrease in price by half every 18 months. And as an empirical observation, it's correct. It still holds true today. The problem is it now takes 18 times as many engineers to achieve Moore's Law as it did back in the 1970s. This is the kind of focus that I bring to looking at what does it cost to achieve innovations, and does the productivity of innovation continue, or does it actually decline? What we have shown is that the productivity of innovation since the early 1970s has declined by over 20%. And this trend will continue, it's inevitable. So that is what I focus on in my recent research.
And really, that's, you're saying it's declining because it takes more energy to get the results.
Scientific research is like anything else humans do. We first pluck the low-lying fruit. Okay. In the 19th century, we had scientific innovations coming from what are sometimes called lone wolf scholars, people like Mendel or Darwin, Marie Curie, who worked alone and developed revolutionary intellectual breakthroughs. But since then, innovation has to more and more involve interdisciplinary teams of scientists working together. And these teams are supported by big institutions that are costly, that have support staff, that have secretaries, and so forth and so on, so that it simply takes more and more resources to produce an innovation. And this is what I mean when I say that the productivity of innovation is declining. It's costing more and more.
Right. More cost up front with less at the end.
Well, even if what comes out at the end stays constant, we still have the issue of more costs up front. And there are other factors involved. Back in the 1980s, when the first cell phones were developed, they required, I think, 30 or 35 elements from the periodic table. In 2013, when a study was done, it was found that this had increased to the area of 60 to 70 elements from the periodic table required to produce a cell phone. We know that can't continue. Cell phone development in the technological sense will someday hit a plateau where it won't be able to grow any farther. And this again is an example of declining productivity of innovation.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add onto this movie and you'd like the audience to come away with from this conversation anyway?
Well, when I give talks on complexity and energy and collapse and innovation, people always ask me from the audience, well, what is to be done? I don't have any simple answers. But what I do say is that the primary thing that everyone can do is to be aware. The first step is awareness. And a film like this, I think, helps a great deal with that if it can get distributed widely enough. Perfect.
And actually, that's a great segue because I have a quote from my friend Dr. Jane Goodall who talks exactly about that, what you just said. So, good segue. So again, I'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise and time with us today. It's been a really pleasure. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to thank the 12th Hour and Vanquish Media for putting this live stream together. And like I said, I do have a quote from my good friend, Dr. Jane Goodall, and it says, the most important thing to actually think about is what you do. To become aware and actually think about the effect of what you do and its effect on the environment and on society. That's the key, and that underlies everything else. So you led perfectly into that. Thank you for that.
Well, it's a very wise saying, and I admire Jane Goodall greatly.
Yeah, me too. She's special. Okay, so we're here today because we want to help public understand the climate crisis better. And I think that you're here today because you want to learn more about climate too. So make sure to come back and join us tomorrow about the 12th hour and learn about the 12th hour and other climate-related topics at 5 p.m. Eastern and 2 p.m. Pacific. My guest will be Dr. Bruce Hood, professor of psychology at the Bristol University, where he teaches the science of happiness. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to having you join us tomorrow. Thank you.